Welcome back to Starborn Tales. Tonight, the fires of Green Hill burn against the night sky, and the true horror of the alien betrayal begins. The night was orange with fire. Thomas sat in his ruined home with his family, listening to the world burn. The walls had holes in them. The roof had a gaping wound where a beam of light had torn through. Cold air poured in, but they couldn't feel it. They were numb. Maria hadn't spoken in hours. She sat curled against her mother, staring at nothing. Elena rocked back and forth, her lips moving in silent prayer. Thomas knew no God was listening. If there was a God, it had abandoned them today. Outside, the alien ships worked through the night. Lights swept across the valley as they harvested everything. Every last potato, every apple, every grain of wheat. The cattle were gone. The sheep were gone. The chickens were gone. Even the fish from the streams were being sucked up by machines that lowered tubes into the water. Thomas had watched them strip the orchards. The trees stood naked now, not a single piece of fruit remaining. He had watched them empty the grain silos. Decades of store reserves vanished in hours. He had watched them tear open the bank and take every coin, every bar of gold, every piece of silver community had saved. Green Hill and the 10 surrounding villages had been wealthy by rural standards. Generations of hard work had built prosperity. Now it was all gone, stolen by creatures who had pretended to be friends. Thomas felt something cold and hard forming in his chest. It wasn't just grief. It was rage. Pure, burning rage. But rage was useless against enemies who could erase you with a beam of light. A sound outside made him tense. Footsteps. He moved a broken window and looked out carefully. Alien soldiers were going door to door. They were checking houses, taking any remaining supplies, food, water, medicine, tools, anything that could be carried. One of them approached Thomas's house. The soldier was tall and armored. Its weapon hung at its side. It kicked open the door. Wood splintered. The alien stepped inside. Thomas stood in front of his family. He had nothing to fight with, no weapon, no plan, just his body between the alien and the people he loved. The soldier looked at them with those dark, emotionless eyes. It scanned the room with a device on its wrist. The device beeped. The alien walked past Thomas to the kitchen. It opened cabinets and swept jars of preserves into a bag. It took a sack of flour. It took a wheel of cheese from the cold storage. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. That cheese was made by Elena's own hands. Those preserves took weeks to prepare. But he said nothing, did nothing. What could he do? The alien left without a word, without acknowledgement that they were even there. They were less than nothing to these creatures. Just obstacles. Insects. When the soldier was gone, Thomas finally moved. He walked to the kitchen and looked at the empty shelves. They had enough food for maybe 3 days. After that, they would starve. The whole village would starve. The whole region would starve. We have to hide what's left, Elena said softly. She had found her voice again. Bury it before they come back. Thomas nodded. It was a good idea. Maybe the only idea they had. He found a shovel in the shed, miraculously still there. Together, they took what little food remained and buried it in the garden. They worked in darkness, trying to stay quiet, terrified that aliens would return. When they finished, Thomas's hands were blistered and bleeding. He didn't care. At least they had something. A tiny chance at survival. The next morning came gray and cold. Thomas emerged from his house and walked through the village. What he saw broke something inside him. Green Hill was destroyed. Most of the buildings were damaged or completely collapsed. The church was a pile of rubble. The school was a burned-out shell. The market square was a crater. Bodies lay in the streets. Neighbors, friends, people he had known his entire life. Mrs. Chun was dead. She had been 78 years old and never hurt anyone. She was lying in front of her destroyed bakery, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Young David Chun was nearby. He was only 22. He should have had a whole life ahead of him. Thomas saw at least 30 bodies before he stopped counting. He couldn't bear to count anymore. Each one was a story ended, a family shattered, a future stolen. Other survivors wandered the streets like ghosts. Their faces were hollow. Their eyes were empty. They moved without purpose, simply existing because their bodies hadn't stopped yet. Mayor Hendricks stood in the ruins of the square. He looked like he had aged 20 years overnight. His white beard was singed. His clothes were torn. He saw Thomas and walked over slowly. "How many?" Thomas asked. His voice was hoarse from smoke and screaming. "In Greenhill? About 60 dead. Maybe more under the rubble." The mayor's voice was flat, emotionless. "Shock. I've had reports from the other villages. Riverside lost over 40. Meadowbrook lost 30. Hilltop lost 25. The total across all 11 villages is at least 300 dead. 300 people, out of 2,000. 15% of their community wiped out in a single day. And they took everything," the mayor continued. "Food, animals, gold, tools. They even took the tractors, the wagons, the plows. They took our ability to rebuild." Thomas looked at the sky. The alien ships still hovered there, black and terrible. "Are they leaving?" "Soon, I think. They're finishing up, loading the last of what they stole." The mayor's jaw clenched. "Then they'll go back to wherever they came from, and we'll be left here to die slowly." "We won't die," Thomas said, but he didn't believe his own words. "Won't we?" The mayor met his eyes. "They took all the livestock, all the grain, all the stored food. Winter is coming in 3 months. We have no animals to slaughter, no seed to plant, no equipment to work the fields. Even if we could plant, we couldn't harvest without tools. They've killed us, Thomas. They just did it slowly." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to find hope somewhere. But the mayor was right. The aliens hadn't just robbed them. They had sentenced them to death. All 2,000 survivors would starve before spring came. Children would die first, then the old, then everyone else. A sound drew their attention. The alien ships were lifting off. One by one, they rose into the sky. The smaller craft docked with the larger ones. The black vessels climbed higher and higher until they were just dark spots against clouds. Then they were gone. Silence fell over the valley. Complete and total silence. No bird sang. No animals made sounds. No children laughed. The world had become a tomb. Thomas stood there for a long time. He thought about Maria, about the girl she had been 4 days ago, dancing and laughing without a care, about the girl she was now, traumatized and silent, about the girl she would never become because there was no future left. He thought about Elena, about 20 years of marriage and love, about all the plans they had made, growing old together, watching Maria marry and have children, retiring to a small cottage by the stream. All of it gone, burned away like morning mist. He thought about his farm, about his hands in the soil, about the satisfaction of watching things grow, about harvest festivals and full storage sheds, about the pride of feeding his family with work he had done himself. All of it stolen, taken by creatures who saw them as nothing more than resources to exploit. Something moved in the ruins nearby. Thomas tensed, but it wasn't an alien. It was a dog, a brown mutt that belonged to the Johnson family. The dog limped out of the rubble, its fur singed, its leg injured. It whined softly, looking for its owners. Thomas knew the Johnsons were dead. He had seen their house collapse with them inside. The dog was alone now, orphaned by violence it couldn't understand. The dog limped over to Thomas and pressed against his leg. It shook with fear. Thomas reached down and petted its head. The dog whimpered. "I know," Thomas whispered. "I know." Over the next week, the survivors tried to organize. They counted their resources. They buried their dead. They attempted to salvage what little remained. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The buried food wouldn't last the winter. The damaged buildings wouldn't protect them from the cold. The trauma wouldn't heal. Children woke screaming every night. Adults stared at the sky constantly, terrified the ships would return. Some people gave up. Old Martin Reeves walked into the forest and didn't come back. Sarah Thompson's wife stopped eating. She just sat in her ruined house and waited to die. No one could convince her to fight. Thomas kept going because he had to, because Maria and Elena needed him. because stopping meant dying, and he wasn't ready to die yet. He organized work crews. They cleared rubble. They repaired walls. They gathered wild plants and hunted small animals. It was desperate, pathetic work, but it was something better than giving up. One evening, 2 weeks after the attack, Thomas sat with Maria and Elena by a small fire. They were eating thin soup made from wild roots and a rabbit Thomas had caught. It tasted like nothing, but it was food. It was survival. "Papa," Maria said. Her voice was small. She hadn't spoken much since that day. Why did they do it? Thomas had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. "Because they could," he said finally. "Because we were weak and they were strong. Because they wanted what we had and didn't care about us." Will they come back? Thomas wanted to lie. Wanted to say no, everything would be okay. But he couldn't. He wouldn't lie to his daughter anymore. "I don't know. If they do, we'll die." It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact from a 12-year-old girl who had seen too much. "Maybe," Thomas said, "or maybe we'll be stronger. Maybe we'll be ready." "How?" Maria looked at him with eyes far too old for her face. "How can we ever be ready for that?" Thomas had no answer. How could humans fight technology that could cross galaxies? How could farmers fight soldiers with weapons that turned people to ash? How could a broken community fight an empire that could take whatever it wanted? They couldn't. It was that simple. Humanity was helpless against threats from the stars. Elena spoke for the first time that evening. "We survive," she said quietly. "That's how we fight. We survive and we rebuild. We don't let them erase us. Even if we're starving, even if we're dying, we hold on. We remember. And someday, somehow, we make sure this never happens to anyone else." Thomas looked at his wife. She was crying. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. But her voice was steady, strong. "How?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Elena said. "But we have to try. We have to hope. Because if we don't, then they've already won. They've already killed us. Not our bodies. Our spirits." Maria leaned against her mother. "I don't feel strong." "Neither do I," Elena admitted. "But we're still here, still breathing. That's strength. That's defiance. We're still alive, and they didn't break us completely. Not yet." Thomas felt something shift inside him. The cold, hard rage he had been carrying began to change. It didn't disappear, but it became something else. Something useful. Determination. They would survive. Somehow, they would rebuild. Somehow, and they would remember this day, this betrayal, this lesson written in blood and ash. Humanity had been naive, trusting. They had believed in peace because they wanted to believe. They had welcomed visitors because they thought kindness would be returned. They had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. But they would learn. They would grow. They would become harder, smarter, stronger. And if the aliens ever came back, or if other threats emerged from the stars, humanity would be ready. Not today, not this year, maybe not this generation, but eventually, someday. Thomas looked up at the night sky. Stars glittered cold and distant. Somewhere up there, the aliens were celebrating their conquest, loading their stolen goods, counting their profits. They probably weren't thinking about the people they had killed, the lives they had destroyed, the trust they had shattered. But Thomas was thinking about them. He would think about them every day for the rest of his life. He would tell Maria the story, and she would tell her children, and they would tell their children. The memory would live on. The lesson would live on. Never trust blindly. Never assume peace. Never forget that the universe is vast and cold and full of dangers humans couldn't imagine. The fire burned low. The night grew darker. Thomas held his family close and stared at the stars. They looked beautiful. They looked peaceful. They looked like a lie. And somewhere in the ruins of Green Hill Village, the brown mutt howled at the sky. The sound was lonely and mournful, an elegy for a world that no longer existed, a warning for a future that had yet to come. The harvest season had ended. The fields were empty. The villages were broken. The people were scattered and dying. But they were not gone. Not yet. Not completely. And as long as even one person remembered, as long as even one survivor held on, the story would continue. The fight would continue. The hope would continue. Tomorrow would come. The sun would rise. And humanity would face another day in a universe that had proven itself cruel. But they would face it. They would endure it. They would survive it. Because that's what humans did. That's what they had always done. That's what they would always do. Even when the stars themselves turned against them. Even when hope seemed dead. Even when everything was lost. They would keep going. They would keep fighting. They would keep living. Until the very end. This was only the first strike, and as the stars watched in silence, humanity's darkest night had just begun. Stay with Star-Born Tales, because the war for survival is far from over.